Given that the word consciousness is going to go in very many different directions, we might begin by looking at a fairly unproblematic sense of the term, which is called access consciousness. This will not shine a light on all the senses that we considered in the first video. It is a very restricted sense of the term consciousness, but by virtue of being restricted, it allows us to say more about it and explore the idea a bit better than with vague terms, undefined terms. Now, you're all familiar with the tip of the tongue state, where, like the butcher here in the shop, there's a word, you know the word, but you can't quite get it. So you're sure you know it, it belongs to your knowledge. You can't quite access it. That's the sense of access consciousness. And the idea, which is just one way of thinking about yourself, is that you know lots of stuff, but you only have access to some of it at a time. Whereas the other stuff, well, here's where Sigmund Freud comes in. I'm not drawing a careful distinction here between unconscious and subconscious. Those two words do mean different things in different contexts, but the very idea that your knowledge consists of a conscious part and an unconscious part is derived from Sigmund Freud. It's not a scientifically robust concept, but it has been very influential, and more importantly, it influences the way that we all talk about ourselves and the way that we all think about ourselves. Now, Freud was notoriously a sex-obsessed Victorian gentleman from Vienna, and yet he has influenced how you think about consciousness. So this idea that some of your knowledge is conscious and some of it is unconscious will be needed to make this term access consciousness work. And we can be a bit more precise. We can say access consciousness refers to the set of all things you can provide verbal report on. Notice we made it into a noun here. That won't work in other cases, but it'll work reasonably well here. Now, there's an assumption here, which is that you can simply report on things in your mind. You can make your own mind up about that. But clearly, this is a not irrational way of exploring one sense of consciousness. And now this gets built up. We're going to start with this idea, and we're going to build it up a little bit, first by thinking around it a bit more and developing a bit more of an elaborate metaphor around it, and then looking to see how we might construct a scientific experiment in this field. So we begin with the metaphor. Now it's dignified here with the word theory, but this is at this stage just a metaphor. Imagine, if you will, that your consciousness is a theater. Your mind is a theater. It's got a stage, it's got audience, it's got stuff hidden in the wings, it's got backstage, and crucially there's a spotlight on stage. Let's call this the theater of consciousness, and imagine that spotlight moving around, picking out different things. The things you can report on are those things in the spotlight. They're the things that you can pay selective attention to. But the spotlight can't illuminate the entire theater. The spotlight can roam over parts of the theater, but it can't illuminate all the parts of the theater. Now we can go nuts with this metaphor. We could imagine that, for example, some things are easier to access than others. Remembering what I had for breakfast is easy, but remembering my social security number is probably going to be difficult. So you can imagine some things are on stage, or we could call it working memory. Why not? We're only playing with words here. Imagine working memory now is the stage, and those things the spotlight can get to fairly quickly, but it's a limited capacity, whereas the audience would assume can be vast, and the audience then stands here for the unconscious, but it's harder to find things in the audience than it is on stage. So you can see what we're doing. We're taking a metaphor and just thinking around it, developing it, and here it goes. You can go nuts like this. So some of our intuitions, vague intuitions about the stories we tell ourselves, seem to find representation here. So the things you can claim to be conscious of at any given moment are fairly limited, as likewise the bright spot on the stage only illuminates a limited sort of amount of things. You can go nuts and do a whole psychology on this and claim that sensory inputs are trying to steer the light one way. Hey, look at this, look at this. But your plans for doing things are trying to steer it another way. Your consciousness of that you need to go do your homework, for example. And we just mentioned that you could even shoehorn some psychological categories like working memory in here. We put that on stage and we make everything else the unconscious. And that's going to be the backstage, the audience, in psychological terms, long-term memory. Who knows what's in there? That's just a metaphor. Metaphors function in the psychological sciences as ways of thinking through the stories we tell about ourselves. And in that context, it gets the name of a theory. So we'll call it now the global workspace theory. It hasn't really been promoted yet. So in the global workspace theory, lots of processing is unconscious. For example, the early stages of word recognition. I flash some letters up. It takes a little bit of time before you can read them. In an information processing and computational way of thinking about yourself, you could say that unconscious thinking can change into make something available to consciousness, make it globally available to other processes. So if you imagine your mind is made up of lots of competing processes, most of which you're not conscious of, one of them suddenly says, hey, my hair's on fire. And all the other processes start to take account. You start to run, to put out the fire on top of your head, and so on. What would that look like? Well, if we think of our thoughts as residing in our brains, which cognitive psychologists do, then that would show up, if something is suddenly available to everyone, as massively distributed activation over wide areas of the brain. In fact, this idea of, oh, my hair is on fire is working fairly well because that's relevant to the whole brain, right? So how do we take this kind of, informal thinking and turn it into an experiment? Well, we can do that. But don't be threatened by this. When we do an experiment like this, it'll be reported with the authority of scientists in white coats, but it's really just creative thinking to see whether these terms we have are of any use. So here's a study from 2001, Cerebral Mechanisms of Word Masking and Unconscious Repetition Priming. Complicated name. What happens in this experiment is that a subject is seated in front of a screen, and on the screen there's a series of displays, and there are two conditions. Let's take the one on the left, and let's assume that the screens are seen from the bottom left to the top right. So we get a jumble of noise, followed by a jumble of noise, each of them very brief, 71 milliseconds, not long. Then we get a blank, and then we get either a word or a blank. So you can see the word lion there, right? Now the next screen is going to be blank. The word was only flashed on screen for 29 milliseconds. That's tiny. So that you go, what was that? But this following screen is blank for 71 milliseconds, and then there's a few more jumbled screens. Now, this left-hand condition contains within it two conditions. Either the word is present, and you might be able to report it, I saw lion, or it's not present. You say, I didn't see anything. There's another two conditions over here on the right, where again we have a sequence of masks. There's a mask followed by a blank screen, followed by a mask. Notice the order is different. Now here comes the word. In this case, the word is note, or it doesn't. But the next screen is a mask again, so that the visual stimulus of the letters is immediately followed by more visual clutter, whereas on the left-hand side, the visual stimulus of the letters was followed by a blank screen. And the idea is here that these numbers and times have been carefully chosen so that most people will recognize the word lion on the left-hand side, but will miss the word note on the right-hand side. And that's the contrast that we're interested in. And you remember when we did a little bit of cognitive neuroscience that we could do, for example, fMRI here. And we could look to see, is the regional blood flow that we can observe in the brain, is it different in one condition or the other here? So here they are, and lo and behold, we're going to get a positive result. The right-hand side, which is here labeled unconscious, refers to the right-hand condition we just saw where the word note was presented, followed by visual clutter, so that the subject never got to recognize the word. They just go, I didn't see anything. And we could see that there's some blood flow in some areas, but not much. But that contrasts here with the left-hand side where the subject successfully saw the word lion. Now we see there's changes in blood flow in many, many areas of the brain. You see that over there? So this is the idea that the designers of this experiment came up with, which is to produce conditions which would distinguish between just itty-bitty little stuff and massively distributed activation in the brain. But remember, this was all just a metaphor. It lies within that group of theories, now generally sometimes referred to as cognitivist approaches, and we've met them here as computational approaches, information approaches to mind. It only makes sense within that theoretical world. Now, I'd like you to consider for yourself what kind of aspects of your personality and behavior and your life can such an approach deal with, and which ones is it maybe inappropriate. That's one thing I do want you to learn in this module, is that we have no single view of the person. Different ways of talking about ourselves lead us to think about ourselves in different ways.